Hello everyone, I'm back. This is Nicole. I have, of course, realized that it is Black History Month, and I don't really celebrate Black History Month during the time that we are, quote, allowed to celebrate ourselves. I think that we are, as melanated people, as Black people, people of African descent, specifically American Africans living in the United States, who are descendants of slavery and still under the thumb of white supremacy, I feel it's disrespectful to say, well, this is your month, Negroes, to celebrate your history, and we're going to sanitize your history and allow you to have your marches and have your events during the shortest month of the year, every year, since its inception. So to that I say, fuck that. I celebrate Black history every day I'm on this side of the dirt. And I encourage you all to do the same, and not, or just to think about it differently, and to not fall for what you are, quote, allowed to do by the dominant white society. And I encourage you to think about that in many other aspects of life. We just had the, Super Bowl to occur, and the horrible desecration of Prince by the white supremacist suspect Justin Timberlake, who shitted on Janet Jackson, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, the greatest artist to ever live, to ever walk this planet. The reason why they have a Super Bowl halftime show, as the Jedi said in his video, is because of Janet Jackson's brother, Michael Joseph Jackson, and completely destroyed this man's, his sister's character, Janet's character. But we were allowed to buy tickets to go to the Super Bowl. We were allowed to pay subscription on cable to watch the Super Bowl if you chose to watch it during this so-called Black History Month, during this so-called time that we are allowed, and I'm gonna keep saying allowed, to celebrate, as they call it, the nigga month. They may not say it on television, they may not say it on their public media, but they say it behind closed doors. I'm sure of that. So don't think that celebrating Black History Month is a way to show whitey that you're important, or a way to memorialize our oppression and the planned destruction of our society. You're not doing it freely, because if we were doing it freely, there would be no reason to publicize it on their media, right? So I move on to why I'm doing this video. I noticed that every year since I was a young child, we would have plays, we would have all types of events at church. We would dress up as historical Black figures: Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and many, many others, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, the list goes on, Marcus Garvey. And we would dress up as these characters. We would do plays. We would have different ceremonies, community center ceremonies, church ceremonies, school ceremonies. But they were always sanitized. And I noticed that a lot of the unseen, unnamed heroes and unnamed individuals of the past who were Black, who were enslaved, who were seen as property, were never celebrated, were never mentioned. People who were heroes to me: Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Queen Nanny. These are heroes to me. And there are many, many others. Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Ben Yaknan, Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Neely Fuller Jr., Dick Gregory, who we've just lost, and Dr. Francis Cress Welsing as well. These are heroes to me. Shahrazad Ali. Baba Kamene, Dr. Layla Africa. These are heroes to me, and these are the people that are not spoken about on mainstream media. But besides that, you have people who are unnamed, who will go unnamed into the eons of history, but were used as a mechanism to build medical institutions, research institutions, such as Henrietta Lacks, where they stole her cervical cells, cells from her cervix, cells from her female reproductive system, internal cells from inside her body that were observed to be immortalized, because when they were allowed to grow on a dish, they continued to grow and reproduce themselves without any type of assistance. Now we have viruses, we have technologies, we have bioengineering that we can do in order to permanently immortalize cells and test the DNA, RNA, protein expression, changes in the protein expression, changes in the DNA expression. But that all began with a woman named Henrietta Lacks. Now, I said that they took her cells, her cervical cells, and they got to that point based on the gynecological analysis and the exploitation of enslaved black women by the man I will talk about in this History Channel article. So this is a story came out last year, 2017, History Stories. And based on the fact that it's on the History Channel, I expect sideways, slanted comments, bias in favor of Dr. J. Marion Sims of South Carolina, I believe 96, South Carolina. Small, very, very small hick town. I think it's a meth town now. Praise the creator for that. Yes, but this article says the father of modern gynecology, in quote, performed shocking experiments on slaves. If you are African American, you already know this. And if you're African American and you don't know this, you about to learn today. So this is a statue of J. Marion Sims in New York City. And based on his work, this tells you, it also should give you a clue as to how racist whites were and are throughout this establishment. It starts off by saying, James Marion Sims developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health and is credited as the, quote, father of modern gynecology, end quote. The 19th century physician has been lionized with statues in New York City, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania. But because Sims' research was conducted on enslaved black women without anesthesia, medical ethicists, historians, and others have called for those monuments to be removed, or for them to be reconfigured as tributes to the enslaved women known to have endured his experiments. Sims, who practiced medicine at a time when treating women was considered distasteful and rarely done, invented the vaginal speculum, a tool used for dilation and examination. He also pioneered a surgical technique to repair vesicovaginal fistula, a common 19th century complication of childbirth, in which a tear between the uterus and bladder caused constant pain and urine leakage. Sims defenders say the Southern-born slaveholder, white supremacists. Let me read that again. Sims defenders say the Southern-born white supremacist, potential pedophile, abuser of women, abuser of children, was simply a man of his time, for whom the end justified the means, and that enslaved women with fistulas were likely to have wanted the treatment badly enough that they would have agreed to take part in his experiments. But history hasn't recorded their voices, and consent from their owners, who had a strong financial interest in their recovery, was the only legal requirement of the time. Critics say Sims cared more about the experiments than in providing therapeutic treatment, and that he caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that black people did not feel pain. And that leads me also to a side note. This is one reason why the meth opioid epidemic is so increasingly devastating to them, because physicians even today prescribe white people higher doses of medication and at a higher frequency and with more access to those medications, therefore encouraging them to get addicted to illegal medications. And once again, I say praise the Creator for that. They say his use of enslaved black bodies as medical test subjects falls into a long, ethically bereft history of medical apartheid that includes the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and Henrietta Lacks. This is a picture of the racist, Dr. James Marion Sims, in a newspaper. It was a portrait of him. I'm trying to read when this was taken, mid-1800s, perhaps. Roots in the slave market. Born in Lancaster County, South Carolina in 1813, James Marion Sims entered the medical profession when doctors didn't undergo the same rigorous coursework and training they do today. After interning with a doctor, taking a 3-month course, and studying for a year at Jefferson Medical College, Sims began his practice in Lancaster. He later relocated to Montgomery, Alabama, seeking a fresh start after the death of his first 2 patients. And when I read the true story behind why he relocated to Montgomery, Alabama, it was in a biography or some type of memoirs about him. It was in an article as well. He did not, it says he relocated seeking a fresh start after the death of his first 2 patients. No, the death of his first 2 patients, they died because he was negligent. And he left because he did not get paid and could not afford to pay his mortgage. He left because he was going to be arrested for negligence. So already you see the seeds of criminality, even with a physician at that time. It goes on to say, it was in Montgomery that Sims built his reputation among rich white plantation owners by treating their human property. According to Vanessa Gamble, university professor of medical humanities at George Washington University, another white supremacist, Sims' practice was deeply rooted in the slave trade. Sims built an 8-person hospital in the heart of the slave trading district in Montgomery. While most healthcare took place on the plantations, some stubborn cases were brought to physicians like Sims, who patched up slaves so they could produce and reproduce, because they were breeders, for their masters again. Otherwise, they were useless to their owners. Remember, many of the men and women on the slave plantations were breeders, and that caused a constant issue, gynecological issue with the women, because they were constantly pregnant, those who were breeders. And your body is not built to be pregnant consistently year after year after year, sometimes having multiple births, sometimes being impregnated by more than one man at one time, therefore producing twins or triplets that are from more than one man. It goes on to say, quote, "This brings up the concept of soundness," end quote, says Gamble. Being a sound slave meant they, quote, "they produced for men and women and reproduced for women. For these women, having this fistula made them less sound," end quote. Like most doctors in the 19th century, Sims originally had little interest in treating female patients and no specific gynecological training. So he was just freeballing out there, freestyling. Indeed, examining and treating female organs was widely considered offensive and unsavory. But his interest in treating women changed when he was asked to help a patient who had fallen off a horse and was suffering from pelvic and back pain. And the woman who fell off the horse, I think it was in France or Belgium. She was like a duchess or princess, a white woman. And he was sent there to help her based on his work with slaves in the United States. His reputation spread around the world. To treat this woman's injury, Sims realized he needed to look directly into her vagina. A bit of a pervert, if you will. He was seen as a pervert at that time. He positioned her on all fours. There you go. Leaning forward, and then used his fingers to help him see inside. This discovery helped him develop the precursor to the modern speculum, the bent handle of a pewter spoon. From his examination, looking at her vagina, that's what it should say, from him looking in her vagina with his fingers in her vagina on all fours like a dog, Sims could see that the patient had a vesicovaginal fistula. With no known cure for the ailment, Sims began experimenting in 1845 with surgical techniques to treat such fistulas. If the patient's masters provided clothing and paid taxes, Sims effectively took ownership of the women until their treatment was completed. He later reflected in his autobiography, The Story of My Life, on the advantages he found to working on people that were essentially his property. Quote, "There was never a time that I could not, at any day, have had a subject for operation," end quote. According to Sims, this was the most, quote, memorable time, end quote, of his life. You can't tell me this man wasn't sexually abusing and sexually assaulting these women. And this is a portrait of a woman who is about to be examined by him and two other men. And these men are probably the ones to hold her down. And there's two other women on the left corner afraid because they're probably next. This is probably taking place in a barn somewhere with a sheet held up, door wide open. So other people outside could probably hear the screaming and hear the suffering while he's doing his, quote, examination. But did patients consent? Sims wrote that the women had, quote, clamored for the operations to relieve their discomfort, but whether they consented or not was never captured in any other historical record. As Bettina Judd, assistant professor of gender, women, and sexuality studies at the University of Washington, points out, consent isn't always about, quote, whether you can say yes, it's also whether you can say no, end quote. Today, we know 3 of the names of the female fistula patients from Sims' own records: Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. Notice they don't have last names because they're property. They're like animals to them, a pet dog. The first one he operated on was 18-year-old Lucy, who had given birth a few months prior and hadn't been able to control her bladder since. During the procedure, patients were completely naked and asked to perch on their knees and bend forward onto their elbows so their heads rested on their hands. Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying out in pain as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. As Sims later wrote, quote, "Lucy's agony was extreme," end quote. She became extremely ill due to his controversial use of a sponge to drain the urine away from the bladder, which led her to contract blood poisoning. "I thought she was going to die. It took Lucy 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation," he wrote. Because the sponge they used were not the sponges you see today. These were sea sponges, and they were not clean. None of the tools he used were clean, probably. For a long time, Sims' fistula surgeries were not successful, and many of the women died. That's something that they have not said here. After 30 operations on one woman, 30 operations on one woman, a 17-year-old enslaved woman named Anarcha, who had had a very traumatic labor and delivery, he finally, quote, perfected his method after 4 years of experimentation. Afterward, he began to practice on white women using anesthesia, which was new to the medical field at the time, because this is pushing towards the Civil War. While some doctors didn't trust anesthesia, Sims' decision to not use it or any other numbing technique was based on his misguided white supremacist belief that black people didn't experience pain like white people did. It's a notion that persists today, according to a study conducted at the University of Virginia and published in the April 4th, 2016 PNAS. And anything that's in bold and underlined has a link so you can go to it. I encourage you to do so. And this is a drawing of Sims' speculum. And you can see how wide it is, which is much wider than a baby's head. Therefore, it should not be put into a woman to open. That's enough for a person's head, an adult head, to go into if it's drawn to scale. Experimenting on slave children. Writer and medical ethicist Harriet Washington says Sims' racist beliefs affected more than his gynecological experiments. Before and after his gynecological experiments, he also tested surgical treatments on enslaved black children in an effort to treat, quote, trismus nascentium, neonatal tetanus, with little to no success. Sims also believed that African Americans were less intelligent than white people and thought it was because their skulls grew too quickly around their brain. He would operate on African American children using a shoemaker's tool to pry their bones apart and loosen their skulls. They didn't continue that, because in the biography and the articles, they said that he had 100% death rate where he was, quote, treating the children's skulls. A shoemaker's tool, if you've ever seen one, he would use that and literally crush the baby's skulls. And these were newborn babies a couple days old, a couple weeks old. I told you there was going to be bias. This is History Channel. History Channel, the reason why Tariq Nasheed started Hidden Colors series. In the 1850s, Sims moved to New York and opened the first ever women's hospital. He moved to New York because his work on the infants and the slave women was too controversial, and he was not getting paid. That was another thing, because he was killing potential slaves. The babies are potential slaves, specifically if they are male. They are potential workers. And he was killing too many of them. And it was bringing too much attention from physicians and abolitionists outside of where he was in Alabama. So in the 1850s, he moved to New York and opened the first ever women's hospital, where he continued testing controversial medical treatments on his patients. When any of Sim's patients died, the blame, according to him, lay squarely with the, quote, the sloth and ignorance of their mothers and the black midwives who attended them, end quote. Sound like Fox News to me. He did not believe anything was wrong with his methods. Sim's practices ignited controversy during his lifetime, says Washington. They're referring to Harriet Washington. She wrote the book Medical Apartheid. I encourage you to read it. It's extremely informative. The medical community debated his methods, and some of his white colleagues even openly objected to his experiments, saying he took things too far, but none of them motherfuckers stopped him. None of them stopped him. How do I know they didn't stop him? How do you know, Nicole? I know because this white supremacist has statues all over the country. Memorials all over the country. He gets recognition to this day in 2018. In a celebratory way. This is a statue of J. Marion Sims. Following the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, many politicians, activists, and citizens are calling for monuments dedicated to Confederate era and other controversial figures to be taken down. And I think this is in Charlottesville. Or no, this is the one in New York. From the top, it's just a close-up. Today, J. Marion Sims continues to loom large in the medical field, celebrated as a medical trailblazer. Bullshit. His statue sits opposite the New York Academy of Medicine in Central Park, New York City, as well as in South Carolina and outside his old medical school. Activists have been working to remove the Central Park statue for several years. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio confirmed that Sim's statue is one of the monuments under assessment in his 90-day review of, quote, symbols of hate, end quote. When I see the statues and memorials to Sim, I see what isn't shown, says Gamble. Debate continues over what should happen to the Sims monuments. Gamble argues that simply erasing his history would do society a disservice. Quote, it would be so easy to say this history never happened. We need to find a way to acknowledge the 3 women whose names we know, end quote. This isn't a new argument. In a 1941 paper titled, quote, The Negro's Contribution to Surgery, end quote, published in the Journal of the National Medical Association, Dr. John A. Kinney of the Tuskegee Institute, considered the Dean of Black Dermatology, wrote, quote, I suggest that a monument be raised and dedicated to the nameless Negroes who have contributed so much to surgery by the guinea pig route. Kinney was referred to the countless individuals like Lucy, Anarcha, and Bessie, whose stories have been erased from history. So he was referring to these 3 women, but there are hundreds, maybe thousands more that are not listed. So I'm going to go to this image of a demon and give you a look. This was just a glimpse into the life of a demon, because that's all I can think to describe him at this time. If you feel differently, let me know in the comment section. I'll come back with more videos as we continue understanding, revisiting, perhaps introducing to some, and just refreshing to others the history of our people in this country, in this establishment. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it wasn't too long. Please like, comment, share, subscribe to my channel. Email me if you wish, or put it in the comment section if you wish to hear about a specific topic. And you all have a great day. I hope it was informative. Thank you.